Yeah, so thank you and welcome everyone to this second to last webinar in the Future Dams webinar series. Today's webinar is about contested baselines and transboundary natural resources management. We're very delighted to have two distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Dale Whittington. Professor Whittington is a professor in the Department of Environment Sciences and Engineering and City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the United States. He is currently a visiting professor at the Abdul Latif Jamil Water and Food Systems Lab at MIT, a visiting professor at the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at the University of Oxford, and a senior research fellow at the Institute of Water Policy at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Professor Whittington is the author of over 200 publications, including with Professor Duncan Macri, a graduate book on public policy analysis. Professor Whittington is the immediate past president of the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis. From 2009 to 2015, he served as a member of the Technical Committee of the Global Water Partnership. And since 2014, Professor Whittington and Dr. Duncan Thomas have offered the University of Manchester's two-part massive open online course, Water Supply and Sanitation Policy in Developing Countries. And that course is on Coursera platform. Over 25,000 students have participated in that course from 184 countries. Welcome, Professor Whittington. And then we'll have Dr. Kevin Wheeler, who will be our discussant for today, and he will present some slides reflecting on Professor Whittington's talk. Dr. Wheeler is a senior researcher and a fellow at the Environmental Change Institute at an Oxford Martin School of the University of Oxford, and principal of Water Balance Consulting. His research and experience focus on shared management of transboundary water courses, emphasizing multi-stakeholder negotiations and cooperative planning to manage environmental risks through multi-objective infrastructure. His methods involve cooperative risk-based modeling, particularly when facing deep uncertainties of future climate changes and growing pressures on natural resources. Since the year 2000, Dr. Wheeler has worked on multiple issues surrounding the Colorado River for a variety of governmental, non-governmental, and private stakeholders. Most notably, he contributed substantively to interim, surplus, and shortage agreements between the 7 basin states, to successful negotiations between the US and Mexico in 2012 on jointly managing droughts and shortages. Since 2012, Dr. Wheeler has extended his approaches to the Nile River Basin by exploring cooperative and development pathways among the core riparian countries of Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. Alongside regional, academic, and governmental partners, he examined alternative cooperative management strategies for new and existing infrastructure to secure water supplies, meet growing energy demands, and support environmental needs. He's an associate editor for the journal Water International, an advisor for the future of the Colorado River Project, and a former research fellow in sustainability science at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for coming online today. Just a few housekeeping stuff, please, to the audience. Please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentations, and please use the chat box to add your questions, and we'll go over them in the last part of the maybe 20-30 minutes at the end of the presentations. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours. Professor Whittington, take it away.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I appreciate everybody attending today. I'm going to be presenting a new paper that I've written for the Future Dams Project, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. This paper will also be published in a special issue of Water International in honor of the late Tony Allen. Tony and I met in Cairo in 1978. We were both working on Nile water management issues, and we remained close friends for over 4 decades. One of the last professional things we did together was a pair of interviews we recorded for my University of Manchester MOOC with Dr. Duncan Thomas that Mohammed mentioned. These interviews are available on YouTube and were published in 2 papers in the journal Water Economics and Policy. I wish Tony were here with us today to share his comments on this paper. I'm sure he would be critical, so you can be critical too. One of my favorite development economists is Albert Hirschman. Hirschman liked to say he didn't offer grand theories, but rather piccolo ideas, little ideas that would hopefully yield insights. So in this spirit today, I'm going to offer you a piccolo idea, the idea of contested baselines. The effect of a proposed or planned policy intervention is estimated using some kind of performance indicator that is associated with the difference between the state of the world without a policy intervention and the state of the world with a policy intervention. Different people use different performance indicators. So for example, in a river basin, we might use hydropower generation, the change between 2 states of the world in hydropower generation, or the lives lost due to flooding or reduction in lives lost. So just as the traveler in this poem by Robert Frost must compare and choose between which road to take, a decision maker must compare and then choose between 2 different states of the world. And because most policy interventions play out over time, this comparison requires a forecast of the state of the world without the policy intervention, which I call the dynamic baseline. And this forecast of the dynamic baseline means that the policy analyst must look down that road not taken as far as she can see, or until the effects of the policy intervention on the dynamic baseline are no longer significant. So I'm just going to try to show you a few little diagrams to illustrate this point using some of the first steps in a policy analysis. So what's the first thing we do in a policy analysis? It's try to understand status quo condition, what's going on. So if we're looking at a river basin, we might look at the hydrology. What's the hydrology of the river basin? We might look at water withdrawals. What are the existing water withdrawals for different purposes? We might look at the infrastructure and to see what's in place. But if we want to intervene in the policy, in the status quo conditions, and try to judge what the effects of our interventions are, we have to look into the future. So we have to look and see where the status quo conditions are headed. And I call this the dynamic baseline. So when we intervene in river basin systems with infrastructure or operating rules, we often, those effects play out over long periods of time. So the dynamic baseline often needs to look ahead. So the next couple steps in a policy analysis, next step is to select a policy option or intervention. So in river basin, this might be to build a new piece of infrastructure. It might be a new operating rule for infrastructure. And if we intervene with option 1 or option 2, this causes a shift in the dynamic baseline. So the way I've drawn this in option 1, this shift starts out small and then grows over time. And for option 2, there's a big impact, big treatment effect early in the planning period, and then it decays over time. Most of the time we do policy analysis, we're really focused on this change. In the randomized controlled trial world, we call this the treatment effect, and we're trying to see how big the treatment effect is and what it's like over time. But the point I want to make here is that that change is dependent on the dynamic baseline that we use, and we often don't pay as much attention to that dynamic baseline. Where it comes from as perhaps we should. So we need to understand where status quo conditions are headed and what the world would be like if we don't intervene in order to measure this difference between these 2 states of the world. So we need to think about what would happen letting conditions evolve. And we can ask the question, well, are things going to get better or are they going to get worse? I mean, and it's important because if our interventions are going to have treatment effects that play out over long periods of time, at least in a river basin. So we need to ask the question, is the dynamic, in terms of the dynamic baseline, is the problem that we're trying to solve going to get better, or is it going to get worse, or is it going to stay the same? Now, the terminology here is a bit confusing, or there are a lot of different terms used for what I call the dynamic baseline. It depends on the discipline you're working and, sort of the culture you're operating in. If you're doing field experiments with randomized controlled trials, or you're in a laboratory doing randomized controlled trials, the dynamic baseline is simply called the control case. And the control case is what happens if you don't intervene. And often these are in a randomized controlled trial, the control case doesn't play out for too long, but it plays out over some period of time in the experiment. We might also call this the counterfactual case or the comparator. Sometimes it's called the do nothing option. But that, as in Robert Frost's poem, do nothing doesn't mean it's unimportant. I mean, it is a road that you could take. Sometimes we call this business as usual. Sometimes we call this a scenario. I don't kind of like the term scenario here because it's kind of ambiguous. Both the state of the world with the policy intervention and without the policy intervention can be called scenarios. So why would status quo conditions change in the future? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Population growth is one obvious one. Economic growth will proceed or not. Demographic shifts, the age structure of population may be different. So if we were designing a healthcare system, we want to take account of the fact that maybe the age structure of the population is changing, urban to rural migration, and of course, climate change. So these are all kinds of things that might affect the dynamic baseline as we look forward. So how do we forecast the dynamic baseline? Again, different disciplines, different kind of analysts do different things. We often have intuitions about what the future is going to hold. A simple thing to do is project current trends. A little more sophisticated is to do scenario analysis, some qualitative brainstorming to see what we think the future might hold, to get different views of the uncertainty in the forecast. Of course, we can also use theory. I mean, we can see what theory tells us about the future, and we can use models of causal relationships. So in the river basin context, we often have river basin simulation models, and in the dynamic baseline, they may have certain infrastructure and operating policies in place. And if we do nothing, if we don't intervene and build more infrastructure or change the operating policy, we can run the river basin simulation models to look at a forecast of the dynamic baseline. Different disciplines have different literatures on this problem of the baseline. I think it's often neglected, but some disciplines pay more attention to it than others. Ecologists actually have a large literature about baselines, but it's a little bit different than the problem that I want to talk about today, because they look to the past to see what the world was like compared to today in order to measure perhaps the loss in an ecosystem. So they're looking into the past to see what baselines were. This is a very interesting literature. I just call your attention to the reference in the middle of this page called Vanishing Fish, Shifting Baselines. And the concept here is that each generation looks to, back about as far as its generation to see what they remembered about what the ecosystem or the ecology was like. And then they compare that. It's very hard to look more than one generation back. But just to give you a personal experience I can remember is when I was learning to drive as a teenager. If I would go out at night, I would get my windshield plastered with insects. And I actually literally have to scrape off the insects from a night drive. Those insects are gone. So my baseline has shifted. Those insect populations are not there now. Anyway, there is a literature on this, but I'm going to talk about baselines moving forward. And in the paper, I identify 3 types of problems or challenges in specifying the dynamic baseline. The first I call the failure to understand the need for a dynamic baseline. I'll call this and thus unexamined baselines. I mean, the dynamic baseline may be examined because policymakers or policy analysts don't feel the need to look. The second problem is failure to account for uncertainties in the forecast of the dynamic baseline, and I call this uncertain baselines. And the third is failure to agree on whether the status quo conditions provide a fair basis from which to think about or forecast the dynamic baseline, and I call these contested baselines, and that's the focus of my talk today. I'm going to illustrate these with this diagram here for a minute. So on the horizontal axis here, we have time. And I'm just going to use one performance indicator on the vertical axis, which will be lives lost due to floods and droughts. So before time t, the lives lost due to floods and droughts fluctuates, but it fluctuates around x3. And then let's suppose I build a dam and the dam is completed at time t, and the lives lost due to floods and droughts drops down to x1. So the difference between x3 and x1 is really the before and after estimate of the treatment effect. So if I was just interested in a before and after estimate of the treatment effect, I wouldn't really need a dynamic baseline. I could just use x3 minus x1 as the effect of building the dam in each period. But let's look at the 2 cases for dynamic baselines. In case A, the forecast of the dynamic baseline, the lives lost due to floods and droughts is getting worse, right? My forecast is if I don't build the dam, there'll be more and more lives lost due to floods and droughts, and that may be because people are moving into risky areas, into the floodplain, population is growing, and more people are at risk. Or maybe it's due to also a combination of things. Maybe I'm worried about climate change, and I think more and more people will suffer from drought. On the other hand, if I have dynamic baseline case A, the treatment effect of the dam in time period t+1 will be x4 minus x1, not x3 minus x1. So the benefits are going to be greater, right, if I have the dynamic baseline. So I would make a mistake in evaluating the dam if I just use a before and after estimate of the treatment effect, x3 minus x1. Alternatively, the dynamic baseline could be case B. Maybe I forecast fewer lives lost due to floods and droughts, maybe because of technological innovations and better flood warning systems. In that case, the before and after estimate of benefits would be too high. But in time t+1, the treatment effect would be x2 minus x1, which would be less than x1 minus x3 minus x1. So that's the case of, and if I didn't know which one it would be, I would be, whether the dynamic baseline should be case A or case B, I would be in the realm or the challenge of uncertain baselines. But what if one party thought the dynamic baseline was case A and another party involved in a river thought the dynamic baseline was case B. Not due to just uncertainty, but because of different interpretations of this past trend or past conditions or status quo conditions. In that case, I might be in a world that I've called contested baselines. And that's what I want to talk about here. Now, there's a point I want to make here about contested baselines is that the controversy over the outcome of a policy analysis could be due to different ethical or political assessments of the appropriate choice of the dynamic baseline. In my previous case, it would be different assessments about whether case A was the ethically correct baseline or case B was the ethically correct or politically correct baseline. Usually we think of controversies being due to the differences about the magnitude of the treatment effect or being sensitive to different parameter values in the estimation of the treatment effect. I just want to raise the possibility that's not the only problem here. It could be that we have a controversy over the baseline. And I'm going to give you an example here from my work in the southwestern United States. Many Native American tribes in the southwestern United States feel that their water resources have been usurped by non-native irrigators and urban water users. So the tribes believe that the status quo is unfair and should be rectified. And any future interventions to deal with such problems as climate or maybe climate adaptation measures should be evaluated after this inequitable distribution of water has been addressed. So tribes actually in the United States view themselves as sovereign entities within the national borders of the United States. So if we were looking at a water reallocation from, say, a non-native irrigator to a tribe, it's similar in some respects to a transboundary water conflict. So if one looks at this reallocation through the lens of international water law and applies the principles of no significant harm and equitable use, the measurement of significant harm presents a difficulty from a welfare economist perspective. And this is because the dynamic baseline for the two parties, the tribe and the non-native irrigator, is being contested. In other words, there's really no agreement on the reference condition from which appreciable harm or significant harm should be measured. So let's look at this first from the perspective of the non-native irrigator. If there's a water reallocation from the non-native irrigator to the tribe, the non-native irrigator feels this reallocation as a loss. And from a welfare economist perspective, the appropriate measure of that loss is the willingness to accept compensation to incur the loss of the water. On the other hand, how does the non-native irrigator look at the welfare gain from that reallocation to the tribe? I mean, they often would look at it as a willingness to pay for what the tribe would be willing to pay for the additional water supply. What are the economic benefits to the tribe anyway if they get that much water? What can they grow? And we should look at the economic value of those, perhaps those crops, to see, what the value is to the tribe. But that's not how the tribe looks at it. From the tribe's perspective, if I look down here at the first at the welfare loss to the non-native irrigator, it's perceived as a reduction in an unjust or even illegal gain. So any estimate of significant harm that the non-native irrigator experiences should be valued much less than the minimum compensation that the irrigator would accept to make them as well off as if the reallocation occurred. And in the southeast corner, the cell where it's the welfare gain to the tribe, from the tribe's perspective, the welfare gain from reallocating water to the tribe should be evaluated as a reduction and a loss, not as a gain from current status quo conditions. So this welfare gain should be measured as the minimum compensation the tribe would accept not to have this reallocation occur. And one thing we've learned in welfare economics is that measures of willingness to accept are much higher than willingness to pay, because people value losses of comparable size much more than commiserate comparable gains. So in this example, look, from the non-native irrigator, they want their loss to be measured by willingness to accept compensation measures, and the tribe wants their gain to be measured by willingness to accept compensation measures. The issue here is that two parties have different baselines or reference conditions from which to measure significant harm. So the non-native irrigator views the dynamic baseline as a continuation of the status quo conditions, and they may have held the water rights for 100 years. So it's natural for them to think that that's the status quo, and the dynamic baseline is a continuation of status quo. But the tribe views the dynamic baseline as a situation in which the past injustices have been rectified. So the two parties have very different perspectives on the problem of significant harm because of the different reference conditions or different assessments of what the dynamic baseline should be. So let me give you two illustrations from the Nile Basin of contested baselines. The first illustration comes from the Tripartite National Committee, which was established in 2014 to address questions about the GERD raised by the International Panel of Experts. So a contract was awarded to these French consultants to assess the downstream impacts of the GERD. So this contract was trying to measure the impact or the difference, and if I go back to my figures, from the dynamic baseline to a world in which the GERD was built and operated in a particular way. But in this case, the consultant's work was abandoned because the parties could never reach agreement on the dynamic baseline. So the dispute was, from what baseline should water deficits to Egypt be measured? Deficits would occur in Egypt under a prolonged drought, not every year. It wouldn't be a normal event, but they could occur in multi-year droughts. And Egypt's position was a deficit should be measured from its 55.5 BCM allocation in the 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. So this was very natural, I mean, because they would feel the loss that way. Egypt would feel that loss. If during a prolonged drought, Egypt could only release, say, 45.5 BCM, then the deficit of 10 BCM would be experienced by Egypt as a loss relative to its 55.5 allocation in the Nile Waters Agreements. But that was not the perspective of Ethiopia. From Ethiopia's perspective, the 10 BCM wasn't a deficit because the original 55.5 BCM in the Nile Waters Agreement was perceived by Ethiopia to be unfair. So it didn't reflect equitable use of the Nile waters. So the 10 BCM difference that between the 55.5 and the 45.5 from Ethiopia's perspective should be viewed as a reduction in an unfair gain, not as a loss. So let me give you another example from the Nile Basin. This was an example as a proposal for cooperative filling and management of the GERD. In 2018 at Cairo Water Week, Carol Hednert gave a presentation based on Deltaris' work for Egypt on the impacts of the GERD. And he proposed an approach for thinking about cooperative management. And in this presentation, he strongly advised against filling the GERD in a fixed period of years, regardless of the inflows to the GERD. And he termed this a non-cooperative strategy and said it was not a wise approach because it could result in severe water shortages in Egypt. And instead, he argued for an adaptive approach or a cooperative approach, and he listed three possible components of a cooperative filling strategy. The first was filling the GERD with a fixed percentage of inflow to the GERD. This was adaptive because if you have a low flow and a fixed percentage, you would fill with Ethiopia would withhold less water. He also suggested maintaining a minimum outflow from the GERD. And also, third, maintaining a minimum level in the Aswan High Dam reservoir. He called maintaining a minimum level in the Aswan High Dam reservoir as the most cooperative approach, and said it's really important for Egypt to have sufficient water in Lake Nasser to irrigate the country. So let's look at this from the perspective of figure 1, where we looked at different dynamic baselines. So from Egypt's perspective here, the proposed dynamic baseline is a continuation of status quo conditions, or a continuation of a target release of approximately 55.5 BCM. That's the baseline. So the first intervention that Mr. Carroll talked about was the GERD in place with non-cooperative filling strategies, and this would cause a shift in the dynamic baseline, which would result in large losses to or deficits in Egypt during periods of multi-year drought. So Egypt would experience this as a loss. And that is how Egypt would see it. And then the Deltares approach was to say, well, okay, the GERD is a fait accompli. Let's suppose that we have a cooperative filling strategy. What kind of cooperative filling strategy could return us to something close to the dynamic baseline? In this case, the losses to Egypt would still be there, but they would not be perhaps significant harm. But Egypt didn't agree with this proposal, and they didn't agree that Egypt's deficit should be measured from 55.5. So they didn't agree on the dynamic baseline. They felt that requiring the GERD to release water to maintain a minimum level at the Aswan High Dam, and also a minimum release, would constrain upstream developments. So really, this was the same contested baselines problem as with the French consultants. There was no agreement on the future conditions from which significant harm should be measured. So let me conclude here with three sort of messages. My messages are not really particularly about the Nile Basin. I'm trying to introduce this idea of contested baselines in transboundary natural resources management. The first point I want to make is that the parties may disagree not only about the allocation principle to share transboundary resources, but also about the dynamic baseline from which significant harm is measured. The second point is that I think policy analysts and decision makers both need to search carefully for the dynamic baseline assumptions. We often focus on the treatment effect and talk about what the impacts are, but the impacts are dependent on the dynamic baseline. And sometimes I said they're hidden in plain sight. I mean, they're right there, but we don't look at them. We need to develop the discipline to actually look carefully at what we're assuming about the dynamic baseline. And finally, I think when baselines are contested, when dynamic baselines are contested, decision makers, policy analysts need to understand and confront this source of disagreement. I think, in retrospect, it would have been very interesting if in the impact studies for the GERD, if the French consultants had done the analysis with two different baselines, if they had used a baseline proposed by Egypt and perhaps Sudan and another baseline proposed by Ethiopia, they would have shown different results because significant harm would have been measured using different welfare measures. But I think they would have been interesting, and it might have highlighted the differences back, 2014. Okay, Kevin, I'm going to turn this over to you at this point.
Okay, I'm happy to take over here. I'm Let's start sharing my screen here. I think if I do this one here, hopefully. Showing in here. There we go. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
We can.
Okay. And you're looking at the large presentation, I imagine, full screen? Okay.
Yes, we can see your
Yes,
slides.
we are, yeah.
Okay, great. So when I read Dale's paper, I really liked it, and I think he hits the nail on the head with core issues, and I think it's articulated very well. And it got me thinking about the other river I work on a lot, the Colorado River, and I realized there's a very similar situation, or I'll make that argument here, see if you all disagree with me. A little background on the Colorado. Colorado is the area I come from, and the river starts up in the mountains on the western side of the Rocky Mountains and flows out to the Gulf of California, and it crosses two countries, US and Mexico, crosses 7 different states within the US, 2 states within Mexico, a lot of irrigation, 40 million people, 30 recognized tribes. Dale was talking about the tribes, there's 30 of them within the Colorado Basin. Refuges, national parks, a lot of energy generated from Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the biggest reservoirs in the US. The unit I'll use here when I talk about this is a ridiculous unit called million acre feet. The rest of the world doesn't use that very often, but it's something we're still attached to in the US. With 1 million acre feet is about 1.25 billion acre feet. So on the Colorado River, it's governed not by one policy, but by a whole compilation of policies that have been shaped over pretty much exactly 100 years, starting in 1922 and still going through today. It's constantly being adapted and updated. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of these pieces that form this contested baseline. The fundamental law of the law of the river is the Colorado River Compact. And what the Colorado River Compact did, if you blow up and you look at some of the text, what it said is in perpetuity, the Colorado River will be divided into an upper basin and lower basin, and will get exclusive beneficial consumptive use of 7.5 million acre feet in each of those upper and lower, or the upper basin, lower basin. It also said the upper states would not cause the flow at the dividing line to be depleted below 75 million acre feet over 10 years. That's how they dealt with variability. The not exactly sure how the variability in the annual year flows. They also set up the framework for Mexico as well. So we've got 1922, a dividing line between the upper and lower basins, upper basins here and lower basins down below, and allocated 7.5 million acre feet to each of them. And also said 75 million acre feet has to pass across the border over any 10 years. There could be some conflicts between these two concepts. So why did they do this arrangement? Well, the lower basin was developing much faster than the upper basin, common around a lot of the world, where civilizations and populations tend to form near the mouths of rivers in a lot of ways. Upper basin or lower basin was developing much slower, and so they wanted to protect the future rights of the upper basin to develop. The state where I come from Colorado, was very sparsely populated at this time, and certainly there was notions of equity based in these agreements between the upper and lower basin when they decided 7.5 for each. Now we go on to the next big piece of this 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico. And in this treaty, basically it said the US will guarantee 1.5 million acre feet of water to be delivered every year to Mexico. Unless there is an extraordinary drought, then they'll reduce uses in the same proportion. And that number was generally based on irrigated area, but a lot of negotiations then. So 2 countries adding on another 1.5 million acre feet for a total allocation of 16.5 million acre feet. summing up those three numbers. Now we know over the long term is about 16 million acre feet of water available. So right away we can see the allocation exceeds the amount of. So we can see this is the average annual flow on the and the flow and the 10-year water use going up. And so they crossed at around 2000 or so. However, it's a little more complex than that because the upper basin isn't actually using all of their water. They say they get 7.5, but they're only using about 4. While the lower basin of Mexico are using their full amount of water. So what's going on here? Well, we know the average flow at about 16. Well, that first part of the year, when the compacts were signed, it was a much wetter time, about 18.7 million acre feet. And more recently, about 13.5 million acre feet. And it could be a trend going down, possibly caused by climate change, or maybe a step change going downward. So, but currently, it's certainly far less than the amount that's allocated. This is a plot of the storages in the reservoirs between the two storages, and we can see how back in 2000, the reservoirs were very full at around 50 million cubic feet, and they've crashed down to about 15 million acre feet in the last since 2000. So a dramatic drop, and you see this in the news a lot now. The reservoirs are very low. So to bring back here, is this another contested baseline? Now, the original compact and treaty were both based on some notions of equity. The lower basin, Mexico developed first and developed fully through time. And the upper basin has always overestimated its development potential and still hopes to use more water. They always say they're going to use more water. This here is actually a plot of how much water they've used and how much water they keep saying they're going to use. They're always saying they're going to use more, and they've never actually used as much as they say they're going to use. So they're always overestimating their future consumption. And furthermore, back in 1944 or 1922, 1944, they did not know anything about climate change at the time. So all these were based on a non-stationary assumption. So with the 15 or the 16 million acre feet between the two and 75 million acre feet over 10 years, the big question is, if runoff is declining due to climate change, should the full risk of climate change fall on the shoulders of the upper basin because it has this requirement of 75 million acre feet over 10 years? If there's less and less water, does that burden all fall on the upper basin as a result? They're only using 4 million. Will they be restricted to that, not develop anymore? Will they have to reduce down to 3.5 million? Those are the questions that are currently being struggled with in the Colorado River today. So is it that dissimilar to the Nile? The upper basin argues that equity was the main objective of the signatories. Therefore, they have the right to develop more and use more water, even though clearly there's no more water to develop right now without harming downstream. The lower basin argues that the compact delivery obligation protecting existing uses is paramount and logical. So maybe there's plenty of reasons to recognize the differences between the Colorado River and the Nile, but there's a lot of similarities as well, with the lower basin developing earlier and the upper basin developing later in time. So we'll just leave it at that as notions of another quite clear example of a contested baseline.
Thank you very much, Dale and Kevin, for the great presentations. Giving us some highlighting this important issue of contested baselines and showing that depending on which baseline you go for, then your evaluation of human interventions in natural resource systems might differ. But also the contention that could be created as a result of which baseline to select, and we've looked at different case studies from the US and from the Nile as well. Perhaps before I start asking some questions, I would like just to remind the audience, please use the chat box to add your questions, and then we'll go over them. But also later, if we've got some time, perhaps we could have some of you ask questions directly. Perhaps the first question that came to my mind when I looked at the framing of the baseline or the dynamic baseline, when we look at it from the angle of water consumption in river basins, are these dynamic baselines the same as water allocations? Are the two the same, two sides of the same coin? How similar are they, or how different are they? I wonder if Professor Whittington, if you've got anything to say about that. You're muted.
Yeah, Mohammed, I think they're often about water allocations, but they don't need to be. I mean, there are other things that can be part of the contested baseline as well. I mean, as Kevin was talking, it can be about the distribution, notions of equity among the different parties. But I think it is often about water allocation. It really depends on the understanding of the parties about what the future holds, and who's, as Kevin said, who's responsible. I mean, who's responsible for bearing the risk? Another way of thinking about it is not in terms of water allocations, but in terms of risk allocations. Who bears the risk of the variability due to climate change?
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree with you on that. Wonder, Kevin, would you like to add anything to that response? You're muted, Kevin.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, like Dale said, certainly a lot of it does come. I mean, people do focus on water allocations as equivalent to demands. I think there's often a big discrepancy. What happens if there's just not enough water? Who's in the example of Colorado? What burdens, regardless of allocation, regardless of how much legally has been allocated, who physically is harmed by it, and is it are there ethics behind that are the wealthiest golf courses in the United States, are they the ones that are able to hold on to the water because they have the finances to be able to do it? While other areas, like the tribal areas, might be suffering because they don't have the economics to do it. So yeah, on top of just straight allocation, there's what are priorities that the society wants to embrace.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for these responses. Perhaps I would also like to jump to one of the final key messages that Professor Whittington showed in his slides. Advising decision makers to confront the issue of contested baselines and try to address that, because that's often the source of the conflict. So is it inevitable that we need to, that at least stakeholders and riparian countries, is it inevitable that they need to agree on a baseline before reaching any agreement on an intervention into the natural system? And do these baselines need to be permanent, long-term? Can baselines be short-term, just to solve a particular issue and then be adapted over time?
Yeah, great questions, Mohammed. I think the baselines, they can be short-term and then adapted. I mean, and I don't think that there has to be necessarily agreement on the baseline to start. I mean, the analysis can be done multiple ways, but I think you need to recognize that you need a baseline in order to calculate significant harm. And if the parties have different baselines, significant harm will be calculated different ways. I would say also that I'm not just talking about water resources here, although those were my examples. I mean, I think that this is more of a generic problem across natural resources management in general, whenever we look at sort of interventions that affect land and water and air, we have to have a baseline, and the equity of different baselines can be perceived differently by different parties. And the parties don't actually have to line up nationally. I mean, it could be that different groups, have similar interest across national boundaries. Farmers and urban, water users could be different. So but it's a great question. So I don't think I don't think you have to resolve a contested baseline to necessarily proceed with the analysis. I see actually in the chat, Elko has asked similar, maybe that's Elko's question that you're reading, Mohammed. Why is it Elko is asking, why is it needed to agree on the baseline when you look at alternatives? Well, I mean, each alternative, Elko, is going to be evaluated relative to some baseline. So you could have multiple alternatives evaluated with multiple baselines. The alternatives in my terminology are actually those policy interventions. They're the things that cause the shift in the dynamic baseline. So you could have different alternatives and different baselines.
Yeah, that's a great response. And perhaps just building on Elko's question there, and I will direct that to Kevin. So if we consider multiple baselines and do this more like a uncertainty analysis or sensitivity analysis, if you will, wouldn't that just shift the problem forward? Because later on, also the stakeholders and the riparians need to sit down and decide on which of the baselines is basically the one that they should take forward. Is it just delaying the issue for a next stage?
Well, I think that and it goes back a little bit to what you said about does our baseline static, and they don't have to be static at all. When you get more information, you can adjust your baseline. At one point, California's baseline was using more water than they are using now, and they had to reduce their amount of usage back in 2000 because they were using the other states' unused apportionments. So their baseline had to shift over time as a result of Arizona in particular was developing more water. It's certainly more challenging than using one simple baseline. You can't treat a transboundary river system like a simple engineering problem where you have one number is the status quo, and as Dale said, you have lots of potential trajectories that we don't know. So those sort of uncertain baselines. And I think when it comes to for me, the contested baseline, I mean, a core piece of it is empathy, is being able to see different perspectives of why another baseline is held by another party. And ultimately, I think that's necessary to get out of the quagmire of which baseline is right versus wrong, is understanding clearly and understanding like heartfelt why it's being held so tightly by your neighbor.
Yeah. You were breaking up a little bit towards the end, but we've heard your answer. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Perhaps moving on to my next question. I mean, we see a lot of studies, being published and a lot of results being communicated. But often these results are reported, without really communicating what that baseline, the baseline behind them. And Professor Whittington mentioned that in one of his final key messages on the importance of understanding the underlying baseline when we talk about results and discuss them. So what advice would both of you give to scientists, but also to the public and to the media when they look at scientific research results? How should they understand them, and how should they communicate them, given that baselines can largely influence the outcomes of studies? Perhaps we'll start with you, Professor Whittington.
It's a interesting question. From the academic side, I think that it's often the responsibility of the reviewers in journal articles. You were saying that many studies don't report. I think it should be the responsibility of the reviewers to make sure that they do report. Often you just see results reported as changes, right? You don't see the absolute magnitudes of the baseline and the state of the world with the policy intervention. So you really should, be able to see the absolute magnitudes and then the change. So this really occurs often in terms of the way the tables themselves are created. I mean, the tables themselves may just report changes, so you can't see what the dynamic baseline is. I think also from a policy perspective, decision makers need to be more aware of this problem and demand seeing a clear articulation of the baseline. I think part of it is that people just naturally want to jump to the impacts. They want to, it's kind of natural, right? You want to jump to the impacts and tell people what are the impacts, and then of doing something. But the impacts depend on the baseline. And if you don't know what the baseline is, you actually really don't know what how the impacts are measured. I think it's also, I've experienced this in my own policy work. It's often hard to explain to people why they need a dynamic baseline. Isn't it enough just to compare the status quo conditions with the change? That's really the before and after case. And I think a lot of people, are satisfied with that. I think more and more people appreciate, the importance of understanding this dynamic baseline, but that doesn't mean it's reported well. I don't know, Kevin, what would you say?
So one of the things that I often get questions about the baseline that I'm using, I have a hard time articulating exactly what sometimes this issue, but people often give too much credit to models. My whole life is running these models, and it depends on what type of model you're using. And this is a very important point in how a model solves to be able to provide an answer. So the way I model things is I enter how much I think people are going to try to use, regardless of water rights at all. It has nothing to do with water rights ultimately. If California is going to use X amount of water, or Egypt's going to use X amount of water, Ethiopia is going to use X amount of water, what I think they physically are going to try to use. Now, that has no bearing on what the rest of the system does. It's simply, if a water user tries to take too much water, they get less water the next time. However, if you're running a different kind of model, more of a system-wide optimization model, where you're trying to satisfy different uses by managing the rest of the system, it does have profound changes depending on implications, depending on what your baseline is. So the kind of nuance it really gets into, are you solving things as a piecewise simulation, or are you solving things more as an optimization? So that's often my explanation of sort of why I choose the baselines. Now, I think it is absolutely critical to recognize that that these baselines do have implications, but there's nothing that precludes trying in these particular studies. What does it look like under different baseline scenarios, depending on different perspectives? I mean, that's not uncommon in a lot of different studies.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great responses. I also often, go through this issue with explaining what my models include. But I fully agree with you. I think in an optimization model, that's different from a rule-based model. So yeah, I think that needs to be explained better, perhaps communicated better to the general public. Perhaps one last question from my side before we return to the questions from the audience. It's hard enough for different stakeholders and riparian countries to agree on a baseline given stationary conditions. But we know that the future is going to change if we just look at the supply side of for example, river basins, water resources. Climate change is going to impose significant changes to the availability of water, and the other side of it is that we don't know how climate change is going to affect things. So how can we take that into account when we negotiate and discuss dynamic baselines for the future, given that we don't even know how the future is going to be? Any pointers or advice that you can give us in that direction, both of you?
I mean, I think Kevin's example of the Colorado just emphasizes how difficult it is in a world of hydrological uncertainty to agree on fixed water allocations. I mean, some kind of risk-based sharing decisions seem to me, one way to go in terms of sharing water in a world with such hydrological uncertainty. But this is also my second challenge. Remember, the second challenge with dynamic baselines, I said, was the uncertainty in the dynamic baselines. I'm going to come back to Elko's question in the chat, which is really a great one. He says, each party can compare those impacts against their baseline. As such, the baseline is just a similar political decision as the alternative itself. I mean, is the baseline just a political decision? Of course, if you from a scientific point of view, if you're working in the lab and you're doing a controlled experiment, your controls are not a political decision. They are what unfold if you don't intervene with your experimental treatment. On the other hand, I mean, in a non-experimental situation, you have to. I mean, as I said, these are contested, and you could look at this as a political decision, but climate change, from the perspective of the stakeholders, is going to be part of nature for a while at least, right? I mean, we obviously want to address it, but that there is hydrological uncertainty at the river basin level. That's not a political decision. So I think this is uncertain. So you have this combination of political decisions and scientific uncertainty in terms of the specification of the dynamic baseline that really makes this a tricky problem.
So I'll add, when it comes to climate change, just watching how the Colorado River has dealt with this. Obviously, everyone recognizes in the Colorado River that back in the 1920s, 100 years ago, they made some mistakes that they were not able to foresee what would happen now. And so what you've seen since 2000, in the last 20 years, a very strong reluctance to commit eternally for anything else at all. And so I see two different ways that non-stationarity is dealt with now. One you can deal with it by having sort of adaptive allocation mechanisms that may ignore or may only take into account the last 30 years or so as more probable than 100 years ago. So that the total volume must change through time based on our most up-to-date projections, especially if we see sort of a unidirectional trend like we're thinking on the Colorado River. It's a little more difficult in the Nile because the total volumes isn't as we're not certain about that. But the notion of not relying on the entire period of record as the baseline and allowing that baseline to change through time, allowing the total volume we think is available to change through time, allocating by percentages, allocating that type of thing. The other mechanism by which they deal with them most often now in the Colorado River is no one wants to commit again for a forever agreement. So U.S. and Mexico, we were trying to get an agreement for at least 20 years, and we ended up with an agreement for 5 years. and said, okay, well, let's do a pilot project and see, well, what happens then? And then if we like what happened then we will continue on what happened, or what we will continue that policy, or we'll expand that policy or contract that policy. And then that was successful. So they extended it for another 15 years or so, until 2026. So coming up soon again, 10 years actually. And then it's up for expiration again. As opposed to committing for a deeply uncertain future, make agreements on for a certain period of time. So maybe the next agreement on the Colorado, maybe it'll be for another 10 years, maybe for another 20 years or 30 years, something like that. But certainly no one's going to be willing to make an agreement, US or Mexico, for another 100 years on it, or to change the underlying compact at all, unless it's written in a very dynamic way.
Yeah, thank you very much for these responses. I can see that there are a few questions from the audience here.